Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. Here's a paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly do they owe it to? The answer isn't what you think. When you trace the chain of creditors, you discover an unsettling truth. The world doesn't owe some specific person, it owes itself. But 4 bankers, across 3 centuries, deliberately engineered this system. They built a structure where debt can never be repaid, governments borrow forever, and interest flows perpetually upward. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented history. Let me show you these 4 architects and how they designed the debt trap that has every government on Earth caught with no way out. William Paterson, The Birth of Permanent Debt, 1694. Before 1694, kings borrowed money the straightforward way. They'd borrow from merchants or nobles, promised to pay back principal plus interest. If they couldn't pay, they'd default, creditors would take the loss, and the system would reset. William Paterson changed everything. This Scottish merchant had an idea in 1691 that would reshape civilization. England was at war with France, and William III desperately needed money. Paterson proposed a deal: organize wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, equivalent to $300 million today, but the loan would never be repaid. The government would just pay 8% interest annually, forever. In exchange, he proposed creating the Bank of England. The mechanism was revolutionary. Merchants give gold to the bank lends to the government pays interest from tax revenue, and the bank passes that interest to the merchants. The key was that the government would never pay back the principal. Why would merchants accept this? Because the interest was guaranteed by Parliament, backed by the government's power to tax. Plus, the bank notes could be traded, which was better than gold because they also earned interest. In 1694, Parliament approved the plan. For the first time in history, national debt became permanent, not a problem to be solved, but a feature of the system. Paterson's real genius came next. The Bank of England got the right to issue paper money, printing currency equal to the value of its loans. This created money from debt. The government's IOU became the currency. The more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. This was the template. Governments borrow, never pay back principal, pay interest forever, and the debt itself becomes money. Brilliant for bankers, disastrous for taxpayers. Within 50 years, every major European power copied this model. By 1790, the newly independent United States adopted the same system. Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeled the American financial system on the Bank of England. Paterson died in 1719, not a wealthy man. But the system he built has lasted 331 years. The Bank of England still exists, and British government debt has never been paid off, just refinanced, rolled over, and expanded, but never eliminated. The debt trap set in 1694 is one every government has voluntarily walked in a sense. Nathan Rothschild, Industrializing Debt, 1815. By the early 1800s, European governments had accepted debt, but there was no organized market for it. Nathan Rothschild changed that by industrializing sovereign debt. The Rothschild family started as money changers in Frankfurt. By 1800, 5 brothers had established banks in 5 major European cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network was unprecedented. They could move money across borders faster than anyone. Nathan was the strategic genius. His innovation was structural. Instead of lending directly to governments, he'd buy government bonds at a discount, then resell them to investors at a markup, creating a secondary market. Governments got cash quickly, Rothschild made the spread, and investors got a tradable asset. More sinister was how Rothschild made governments dependent on him. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. He first sold British bonds, signaling British defeat, and prices crashed. Other investors panic sold. Then he bought massively at rock bottom. When victory news arrived the next day, bond prices soared, and Rothschild made millions. By 1820, Rothschild dominated European sovereign debt. Governments needing to borrow had to go through them because they controlled the investor network, distribution channels, and terms. Why does this matter? Before Rothschild, governments could theoretically refuse to pay. But Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. A British bond might be held by a French investor, sold to a German bank, then used as collateral for a loan by an Austrian noble. The ownership network became so complex that defaulting was no longer about refusing one creditor. It was about destroying the entire international financial web. That was Rothschild's innovation, making debt so interconnected that default became impossible, not because governments were responsible, but because default would trigger systemic collapse. Governments were trapped. They had to keep paying, had to keep borrowing to pay interest on old debt. Rothschild family wealth peaked in the mid-19th century, making them the world's richest family. That wealth came from one source: interest on sovereign debt. They didn't produce anything. They just lent money to governments and collected interest forever. J.P. Morgan, The Mechanism for Infinite Debt, 1913. By 1900, the American economy was powerful, but its financial system was primitive. After the 1907 financial panic, J.P. Morgan personally organized the bailout, effectively acting as America's central banker. But he was 70 years old and needed a permanent solution. Morgan and his associates designed a central bank, but Americans hated central banks. So they disguised it. In 1910, Morgan's associates secretly met for 9 days on Jekyll Island, Georgia, to design the Federal Reserve System. The meeting was kept secret because if the public discovered bankers were designing the national monetary system, there would have been riots. The plan was brilliant political manipulation. The Fed wasn't called a central bank. It was called the Federal Reserve System. Not one institution, but 12 regional banks. It looked decentralized, democratic, public, but the structure ensured banker control. The regional feds were privately owned by member banks, which elected the boards. The most important power, creating money and buying government bonds, went to the New York Fed, controlled by Wall Street's biggest banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed in December 1913, with most congressmen not understanding what they were voting for. The debt trap immediately expanded. Now the government didn't just borrow from banks, it borrowed from the Fed, which could create money to buy bonds. The government issues bonds, the Fed buys them with newly created money, the government spends it, and the debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet, backed only by taxpayers' permanent promise to pay. This was the mechanism for infinite debt. The Fed ensured there was always a buyer for government bonds, so the government never had to stop borrowing and could roll it over forever because the Fed would always buy. Interest flows from taxpayers to the banks that own the Fed system. Morgan died in 1913, but his legacy is the structure that makes America's current $38 trillion debt possible. Without the Fed, the government couldn't borrow at this scale. But with the Fed as a guaranteed buyer, there's no limit. The debt trap became infinite. Paul Volcker, The Inescapable Trap, 1982. By the 1970s, the debt trap was operating globally. But developing countries were different. Many couldn't pay, until Volcker made it permanent. Volcker was Fed chairman from 1979 to 1987. To crush inflation, he raised the federal funds rate from 11% to 20%, the highest in U.S. history. This crushed inflation but had another effect. Developing countries had borrowed billions in the 1970s when rates were low. Now their loans were coming due, but rates had tripled. Mexico owed $80 billion, Brazil $60 billion, Argentina $40 billion. Interest alone exceeded export earnings. In August 1982, Mexico announced it couldn't pay. This should have triggered global financial collapse because U.S. banks had made most of the loans. But Volcker arranged a bailout through the IMF. The IMF lent these countries enough money to keep paying interest to American banks. The loans came with conditions: cut spending, privatize, open markets, devalue currencies, essentially dismantle economic sovereignty in exchange for the privilege of continuing to pay interest. The key was that IMF loans didn't reduce debt, they just rolled it over, making it manageable but permanent. This was Volcker's innovation. When debt can't be repaid, don't forgive it, restructure it. Lend enough money to keep interest flowing in exchange for political and economic concessions. The debt trap became a control mechanism. This pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every time, it's the same structure. IMF loans keep interest payments flowing, austerity gets imposed, sovereignty gets surrendered, and debt is never eliminated, just restructured into perpetuity. Volcker died in 2019, but his legacy ensures the debt trap is global and inescapable. Even when countries can't pay, they're not allowed to default. They're refinanced into permanent obligation. How the system works. Now let me show you how these four architects built a system where debt is infinite and escape is impossible. Paterson's template: governments borrow, pay interest forever, never pay principal. Plus Rothschild's innovation: make debt globally tradable so default destroys the system. Plus Morgan's mechanism: Central banks create money to buy government bonds, infinite demand. Plus Volcker's trap, when payment becomes impossible, restructure instead of forgive, keeping interest flowing. The result is today's $315 trillion in global debt, government, corporate, household debt. None of it will be repaid. All of it pays interest. All of it is connected through the financial system. Default anywhere threatens global collapse. The specific mechanism: the U.S. has issued $38 trillion in debt. About $20 trillion is held by the American public, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the federal. These bonds pay about $1 trillion in interest annually. That interest comes from tax revenue, so it's a permanent transfer from taxpayers to bondholders. The other $18 trillion the government owes itself: Social Security trust funds, Medicare trust funds. Expand this globally. Japan owes $9 trillion, Europe $14 trillion. China has massive domestic debt. All countries run the same system and are interconnected. Japan holds U.S. treasuries. The U.S. holds European bonds through the IMF. Europe holds developing country debt through the World Bank. It's circular. Everyone owes everyone, and interest flows upward to the institutions managing the debt. Why it can never end. If the U.S. paid off the $38 trillion, the money supply would collapse. Because dollars are created when the government borrows. Pay off the debt, and those dollars disappear, causing deflation, depression, economic collapse. So the government can never pay it off. It must keep borrowing, rolling it over, paying interest. Same globally. If every government paid off its debt, global money supply would shrink by 2/3. There wouldn't be enough money to conduct trade, and the system would freeze. So the debt can't be eliminated. It's structural, by design. Who profits? The institutions holding the debt: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity. These asset managers control tens of trillions, buying government bonds with other people's money and collecting interest. Just U.S. debt alone is about $1 trillion annually, plus Japan, Europe, and others. That $1 trillion a year in interest flows from taxpayers to bondholders. The largest wealth transfer in history, continuous, structural, invisible to most because it's not called a tax, it's called debt service. The final truth: the four architects didn't conspire. They lived in different centuries. But each solved a problem in a way that benefited bankers, and each solution built on the previous one. Paterson made debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild made it global in 1815. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. Together they built a system where governments borrow forever and pay interest eternally. The people who control the bonds, manage the debt, and collect the interest are the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments, not taxpayers, but financial institutions. The $38 trillion isn't a crisis to them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet, paying interest, providing collateral for more lending. As long as confidence holds, as long as people believe governments will pay interest, even if they never pay principal, the system works. The debt trap is complete, with no escape possible, except by destroying the entire financial system. For architects, 3 centuries, 1 system. Everyone on Earth is now trapped in it. The $38 trillion isn't an accident or mistake. It's the system working exactly as designed. The debt isn't a problem to be solved. It's the foundation. And interest is the rent we pay for it.